The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together.
Well, they didn't.
Very serious. The referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hello, this is Scottish Independence podcast number 59, and this time I spoke to Alasdair Stephen. Alasdair's an architect and recently delivered a lecture about architecture and independence and how architecture is politics. And I thought that was very interesting, so I decided to get him on. So we'll just go straight to it and I'll have a wee word with you at the end. Hello Alasdair, how's it going?
Fine, how's yourself, Michael?
Not too bad, but getting fed up of winter. Don't know about yourself, but I decided to ask you on because I read part of an interesting lecture you did about architecture and politics, and architecture is politics. Could you just expand a bit on those ideas that you talked about for the listeners?
Well, when I was at university, we had this lecturer in third year who came in, and he was a sort of revolutionary communist called Jonathan Charlie. Now, at that point, when I was doing architecture, I wasn't completely engaged. I mean, my main interest was actually, I'd spent my first year campaigning for Jim Sillars in the 1998 by-election in Govan, and architecture was really a secondary interest. But when Jonathan Charlie came in, this guy from Bristol, I think it is, the first thing he did was he told our class, look, architecture's much more than just design. And the first project we did was he took us to Drumchapel, and we had to look at this children's home, and we had to redesign it. And part of the project was actually to explain, to analyse the problems associated with children's homes, look at the policy behind it. So I went off, spoke to my mother, who's a social worker. I spoke to Strathclyde Regional Council at the time, and they explained they were taking money. They didn't have much money, but they were taking it out of these children's homes. They were putting it into support centres. So from that project, I realised that if you look at the politics behind it, you'll come up with a different piece of architecture. So the piece of architecture I came up with was changing the actual function of the building, but doing it in a sort of minimal way, minimising the cost. So I thought I did a good job in that project, but when it came to actually getting it marked, it wasn't marked by Jonathan Charlie, it was marked by some other tutors, and they thought it was a load of rubbish, and it almost failed. But the point was that it changed my mindset about architecture. I realised it was much more important and a much wider subject. And from that I went on to the next project I did was I looked at housing in Skye. I looked at housing in Donegal with my friend. My mother's from Skye, and my friend's mother Michael, she was from Donegal. So we looked at the different patterns of housing, the different problems associated with it. And from there I've always thought that architecture, it's quite interesting because if you're an architect, you get invited to join National Collective because you're seen as an artist, but you're also dealing with the capitalist system. You're sort of serving this big beast. But on top of that, you're also involved in politics because every day you're seeing the effect of policy on people's lives. I will have people turning up at an office saying, I want to build a house for my son. He works in a small Highland community, and you have to explain to him, you do realise that land will cost you £100,000 and you won't be able to build a house, and your son won't be able to stay in this community. So that is why architecture is politics. It's much deeper than that and wider than it, but it's fundamentally what we do. We deal with issues which are fundamentally political in every aspect.
So what are the problems with the current situation in architecture in Scotland, but also I suppose in the wider United Kingdom?
I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, I think in Scotland there has always been a particular style of architecture. I mean, we're quite lucky in that respect. When you're in Scotland, when you cross the border, you can see that you're moving from a predominantly brick country to a predominantly stone country. If you go back to, say, the Broch, the massive solid walls, you can follow the history of that right through to the mass of the tenements. So when you design in Scotland, you take that into account. You have to take into account that there is that history. And it's much more than just mass, it's also detail, etc. But the fundamental thing that affects architecture in Scotland is the response to the weather and the landscape. The weather in particular, if you look at the Black House, the way it was designed, you would think where you've got high amounts of rain in the west of Scotland, you would have a steep pitch in the roof to get the rain off the roof as quickly as possible. But you had a low pitch in the Black House, and that was because it was a response to the wind. It was a response to the storm more than anything. And even looking at the houses in the small fishing villages in the northeast, the gables are facing the sea, facing the storms. So that is a response which architects still have to think about today. They have to think about the wind loads. They have to think about the rain which comes up vertically, the rain will get in the smallest little hole. My father is an architect, and he said the fundamental purpose of an architect in Scotland is to stop the rain getting into a building, because when rain gets into a building, that's when you start getting sued. But that affects the design. So although a lot of architects in Scotland won't design in any particular Scottish style consciously, there is, because of the impact of the rain, the impact of the storms, the impact of just the history of architecture in Scotland, even subconsciously, it will manifest itself in the design.
Are there big problems with modern buildings not being built to that style and that standard?
I think with modern Scottish architecture, the main problem with modern Scottish architecture, well, there's various problems. One of them is you have some very good architects like Page and Park, like Malcolm Fraser. Now, I was given a lecture, the one that we're discussing just now. Malcolm Fraser also gave a lecture at Strathclyde University at the same time. And he was making the very good point that 15 years ago, he was designing the same sort of size of buildings that he's designing today. It's the same with other architects like Page and Park. Architecture practices like myself were designing similar sizes of buildings as we were 15 years ago. And the point he's making is that it's almost impossible now for Scottish architects to move up the next stage, for him to win the big commissions in Scotland, because these are always won by outside architects, by these star architects. They will come in and they will build and they will win all the big commissions. Now, that's very problematic for Scottish architecture, because it means that there really appears to be no way that architects can move on to the next level. It's very difficult. Now, this is because of procurement, but it's also because in Scotland in general, there's a lack of respect for people who are homegrown. There's this idea that in order to succeed, you have to go away. If you have stayed, you have failed. And because of that view, that lack of confidence in who we are ourselves in this country, that will manifest itself in architecture practices who are extremely talented, just not being given the chance to win competitions. So that's a problem with architecture in Scotland at the moment. But in general, for the medium-sized projects, the quality of architecture is extremely good. I mean, it's much, much better than it was 15, 20 years ago when I started. You just have to pick up the RAS annual review of Scottish architecture. And if you look at one from the early 90s, it was embarrassing. Now, Scottish architecture, it might not be as good as the best in Europe, but it's getting there, and it's something we can be proud of as a profession.
Do you think independence would improve the procurement problem?
Yeah, I think procurement is a huge problem. I think the Scottish Government is aware of this. The Scottish Futures Trust, for example, I know that was a response to PPP, PFI, and the Scottish Government had to save a lot of money. There was a lot of wastage. But in effect, what's happened is that Scotland's been divided up into different sections. You have these bodies which now deliver huge government projects, be it schools or hospitals or whatever. They'll deliver it in those particular areas, and you effectively have one large company, with probably a contractor, who will be in charge of delivery. Now, that can make all sorts of efficiency savings, but as Malcolm Fraser explained last week at this lecture, architecture is just, is seen as being completely unimportant now. We're just a doorknob that can be changed. It's just part of the specification. So rather than the architect leading the whole process, the architect has been as utterly dispensable. And so it's the money men, it's the lawyers, it's the builders who are looking at the bottom line more than anything. You don't have people who are in charge who are actually thinking about what sort of country are we designing here, what sort of communities are we building, what sort of experience are the end users having. It's all about saving money delivery. So you'll notice that when Scottish Future Trust do a review or put a press release, they will say, we have saved this much money. They never mention what sort of buildings they've delivered, how good they actually are, how small Scottish practices, medium-sized Scottish practices, architects in general have been completely disenfranchised from a lot of projects where they should be leading the way. And it's a huge problem, and I think the Scottish Government are reviewing it, and the procurement, which has been for architecture and the end quality of buildings, been a bit of a disaster in the last few years. I think that will change, and I hope it will certainly change with an independent Scotland.
Sorry, just to come back to what you said about lack of respect, do you think we should have more pride in some of the buildings that you find around Scotland? For example, my friend over a period's been sending me pictures of some of the amazing things in Glasgow that have been pulled down. And you just think, how on earth could they have been pulling these buildings down instead of restoring them? Do you think that it's the lack of respect that you mentioned that causes this kind of thing?
Yeah, it's partly that. I mean, for an architect seeing a building being pulled down, especially a great building, it's sort of mixed emotions, because a lot of architects will say that's terrible, but there's an opportunity for another architect to do something maybe even better. So, yeah, it's terrible. But I remember when a building went on fire on Princess Street a few years ago, and my friend Sandy, who's an architect in Edinburgh, he just thought that is a great opportunity to do something great in Princess Street, because Edinburgh doesn't really change much, and architects don't get the chance to do anything really fantastic there, to use their imagination. So, there is a lack of respect, but that lack of respect for me is, in Glasgow, for example, and this is what I said, last week in the lecture, if you look at the pavements, that's where I see a lack of respect. I said to Professor Alan Rear from Glasgow University, he's Professor of Scottish Literature there, I was giving him a lift back from Skye a couple of weeks ago, and I said to him, what I don't understand is why when a workman has to fix a pipe, he digs up a pavement, why they don't put the pavement back the way it should be. It's always left, invariably it's left a bit of a mess. Now, it might not be the workman's fault, it might just be the specification that they're told to work to, but he said, well, this actually demonstrates a lack of confidence, a lack of self-respect, because you effectively don't care. It's why you throw down chewing gum on a beautiful street in Glasgow. It's why you don't fix the pavement. It's because perhaps you've been told that you're not worth it. You've been told that your country shouldn't be independent. You've been told that you can't run your own affairs. You've been told that you're not that good, that uniquely you can't run your own affairs. And that can manifest itself in many ways, and it can manifest itself just in a lack of respect for our architecture. Is anyone really aware how amazing our architecture is in Scotland? How we've got some of the best castles in the world set in the most amazing landscape? How many people are particularly aware of that or proud of that? We compare it internationally in many respects. But if you're not aware of that, and if you're told that you're pretty second rate, well, you'll treat not just your environment, but you'll also treat yourself pretty badly. In some ways, that's the thesis. So, I think, Scotland has a huge amount to be proud of, but pulling down buildings which shouldn't be pulled down, not appreciating how wonderful our streets are, and by not appreciating how wonderful they are, that, again, is shown in the fact that city planners will allow out-of-town shopping centres to be built, American-style shopping centres to be built. Inverness is a perfect example of disastrous town planning there. Everything is dominated by the car, and what was great about our cities, the walkability of our cities, the vibrancy of our cities and our city centres is lost. And that's something that we as architects, town planners and politicians have to try and put right.
But is that problem of everything moving to the big shopping centre out of town a Scottish problem, or more of a kind of global problem?
Well, I don't think it's a particularly Scottish problem. I think it's a problem across the UK. It's a problem that goes back to when they decided that the motor car would take precedent over legs. Everything was designed around going from A to B in a car. And if you've ever dealt with the roads department when you put in a planning application, they have this rule book. This is changing slightly now, but they have this rule book where everything has to comply to incredibly high standards in order to get a vehicle to move from A to B, in order to turn it around, in order to get it out of a particular space. You've got to have a certain number of parking places for each house. And that means if you look at any of the beautiful villages in Scotland, for example, Inveraray, none of them would meet the road standards. So they couldn't be built. You just can't design in the way that these beautiful little villages, which were designed around markets, designed around walking, designed around community, you just couldn't build them anymore. If you look at Tyree, I think this is something that Anderson, Bell and Christie did. They did an exercise on this where they took this beautiful, absolutely gorgeous island of Tyree. If you've never been there, you have to go. It's just amazing. But there, people will park in the grass outside their houses. Now, what they did was they took a map of Tyree and they applied the Strathclyde Regional Council road standards against that island, and it just became a sea of tarmac, and island is destroyed. Now, that's the sort of thing which is changing. The Scottish Government is bringing out, designing streets, for example, which is about the walkability of villages, of towns, of city centres, where the car isn't the be-all and end-all of design. But, we've made mistakes. Inverness, for example, is appalling. If you look at the way that's been developed, you've got a lovely town centre, but you go further out and everything is designed around motor cars. And you've got these American-style retail parks with your McDonald's and Burger King and things like this, and it's awful. That's the worst thing about American culture, I think, is the fact that you have to drive somewhere to buy a burger. To do anything to get to the shop, you have to get in a motor car and drive, and that's why they've got no pub culture, for example. That's why it's very difficult American teenagers to go and meet each other because they all live a car ride away. And it's something that we didn't have in this country. It's something that we sort of introduced, but it's something that we can change, and hopefully we will change.
A previous guest on the podcast talked about how one of the things we don't appreciate in Scotland is tenements and how fantastic they actually are as buildings, how they're just the right size for having a good sort of style of community. And she also said that one of the things we should be doing to improve the situation
is by doing what they've done in some of the Nordic countries, like adding lifts to all those tenements. And just it'd be interesting from your point of view, firstly, if you think that's true about the tenements, and second, are projects like that feasible? Maybe adding lifts to all of the tenements and putting other add-ons onto the tenement buildings that already exist.
Well, the thing about the tenements, I'm old enough to remember back in the 70s where, you went around Glasgow and, I was a very, very wee kid at the time, but you went around Glasgow and what you'd see tenements getting knocked down everywhere. The tenements were black. A lot of the tenements were very badly run down. They were slum buildings in effect, but they were just being cleared. And it took architects within Glasgow to actually mount a campaign against this and to save a lot of the tenements. And they can easily be amended and adapted and brought back to life. And, the tenement, you're right, the tenement is a fantastic engine for living in. They're wonderful buildings and there's a beautiful scale about them. And what we have to do in Glasgow, I remember having a lecture when I was at university years ago from Gordon Bennett. Now, he's the guy who designed the Museum of Scotland. He was brought up in Glasgow and he was showing pictures of Glasgow when he was a wee boy. And he was saying, look, I could walk from this end of Glasgow to that end of Glasgow and there was the same character. The city was as one. It was a beautiful city which had the same character from one end to the other. And then he showed photographs of the places that he passed on the way to school when he was a young kid, and they weren't there anymore. There was cleared sites, there was motorways, there was railway lines, there was all sorts of things which had sort of destroyed that character. But he said, Glasgow's quite lucky in that we can knit this city back together, and he said that should be the purpose of architects and the planners, is to try and knit this city back together. So that's when I see an empty site in Glasgow, I always think, was there a tenement there before? Can we put a tenement back in there? There's no reason whatsoever. And that's one of the disappointing things about the east end of Glasgow. You see these little pubs. It's like the Clua bar, which had the tragedy recently. Now I'll say Clua because it's a Gaelic name for Clyde, and if there's any, it's a bit late now, but if there's any journalists listening, you don't pronounce the TH in Gaelic. But anyway, there you have a perfect example of a pub where the actual tenements around it were taken down, and you'll see these pubs all over Glasgow, especially in the east end of Glasgow. Now, what I would love to see in the east end of Glasgow is the tenemental style buildings being rebuilt and the city being knitted back together. But instead what you've got is different housing associations who've got their own different architects, their own different styles, and the building is sort of mishmash of different buildings at different scales all over the place, and it doesn't really feel like Glasgow anymore. It doesn't feel like like part of the city. But that's not to say that we can't make changes, we can't improve it. And I live in the West End here, and there's just been quite a nice infill site just built with new tenements just across the road from me, and that's what we should continue to do.
So how do you go about putting that grand plan together to try and sort of knit the city back together?
Well, it's really up to the council, and you can have planners within the council who have a grand plan to revitalise the city. They can have fantastic master plans, but unless that's adhered to, then it's not really worth much. You have a situation in Glasgow where city councillors will overturn their own master plan. They'll overturn recommendations from their own planners just because, I don't know, what's the reason that they're doing that. It's very easy for a developer, the higher he can build, the more money he will make, because they're building off effectively the same foundations. So when a developer comes in, when the city needs money, the city needs jobs, and says, I have got to build this high or I've got to build this low because that's the only way it'll make my budget add up, then it's quite a lot of pressure on the councillors to say, yes, we will let you do that, but they have to be careful, because if you do buckle to that pressure, then your master plan goes out the window. You lose the idea of knitting the city back together in sort of one overall sort of whole. Now, I was in Manchester last week and I met the master planner for that city. And that was the back of the IRA bomb. What happened there was the place was it had to be regenerated. It was regenerated, but it was all based on the fact that this extremely talented architect produced a fantastic master plan. And that master plan said we are going to regenerate on the back of fantastic modern architecture. And one thing that we have to be careful of, both in Glasgow and in particularly Edinburgh, and really in particularly Aberdeen, is being so conservative with our master plans, with what we allow to be built, that we don't actually create something new, something exciting. And I think Aberdeen is the best example, maybe the only example of a sort of medium-sized city, probably in the UK, but certainly in Scotland, that actually hasn't regenerated itself through architecture. I mean, there isn't one building of note that's been built in Aberdeen probably in the last, 100 years. Maybe that's been a bit unfair, but where is the great architecture there? They have great sites, but where's the great architecture? Now, you compare that with Dundee, what Dundee's done. It has used architecture, it's used landscape architecture to revitalise itself, to reinvent itself, and then, with the new V&A architecture, new V&A museum by Kumo Architects, what it's done there is it's producing one wonderful piece of architecture which will make Dundee world famous. I know Dundonians think they're world famous already, but they're only world famous probably in Scotland, or maybe just Dundee itself, but it will make Dundee world famous, just like what happened in Bilbao. And on the back of that, you'll see a huge amount of inward investment. I think already they're looking at £1 billion of inward investment on the back of one building. Now that demonstrates the power of architecture, the power of good architects. And Glasgow has got to make sure. I don't think Glasgow has produced any significant large building which is that standard. I can't think of any. Edinburgh doesn't, because Edinburgh is so conservative. People go to Edinburgh still to see the castle. I suppose the new Scottish Parliament is a wonderful piece of architecture, and it does attract visitors in. But it's not getting the same. It's not the same sort of scale as what happened with the Guggenheim in Bilbao, or what will happen with the V&A in Dundee, where the whole city is effectively regenerated in the back of it. I mean, Edinburgh doesn't have to do that. Edinburgh's an amazing city already. It doesn't really need wonderful architecture to regenerate itself, but it does need wonderful architecture. And Scottish cities have got to be aware of the power of architects to be transformational.
There's a lot of work to do, but if I could just move on to you personally, I believe you're a yes supporter for the upcoming referendum, but everyone's got a different reason why they move to yes. Sometimes it's something from their work, sometimes it's something personal, emotional, economic. Could you just tell us why you support independence personally?
I find it quite difficult to remember when I decided to support independence, but I know, thinking back as a wee boy, maybe about 8 years old, I remember 8 or 9 years old, saying to my father after watching the 1979 devolution referendum, and I was watching on telly, and I remember saying to my father, I was watching it on the news, most evenings, and I remember saying to my dad, "Did you vote yes or no?" And he said, "I voted yes," and I was completely shocked, because from what I picked up as an 8 and 9 year old watching the media I thought, well, everyone must be voting no, because that's the obvious thing to do. So I remember then thinking, well, maybe I'm being manipulated. I wouldn't have known that word at the time. Maybe I'm being manipulated, because that's the impression I got. But I remember getting slightly older. I was still interested in politics. I was interested in, I suppose I was sympathetic to the ideas of the Labour Party when I was a wee kid. But I remember when I was maybe about 13 watching SNP conference, and it was from like the noon town hall or something, and it wasn't very professional looking, I must admit. It was a few guys sitting in front of some wallpaper desks with a couple of saltires pinned at the front. And I remember listening to some particular guy just thinking, well, what he's saying is absolutely right. I totally accept what he says. So I remember then thinking the SNP are correct. But the point when I joined the SNP, I was very sympathetic and supported the SNP, probably at the age of 13, 14. But at the age of 15, we had this pastoral visit by a retired minister who, I was living in Italy at the time, and the doorbell rang, and it's a minister's come to the door, so you immediately run upstairs and hide in your bedroom so you don't have to say a prayer with them. But my mother called us down the stairs and said, "Look, the Reverend Sam Aikenhead wants to say a prayer with you." So he sat down, he gave a prayer, and he gave a prayer for Scottish independence. My mother had explained to him that we support Scottish independence, and he said afterwards, boys, now, we've got an SNP branch meeting tomorrow, and I'm going to take you along to it. Is that okay? We said, yes, that'll be great. We'll join up. So the next day at school, we went in, and our very good friend at school, Richard Lochhead, we said to him, he wore SNP badges to school, but he wasn't a member. We said, "Richard, we're going to join the SNP tonight. Do you want to come?" And he said yes. So he was picked up by the minister. We were picked up by the minister. We went down to local hall, and we all joined the SNP that night. And ever since then, the SNP, it's been quite a privilege to be part of the movement. It's been a privilege to see where it's come from, because in those days it was, it really was on its knees. I think a pivotal moment in how we've got here, I mentioned before, was Jim Sillars winning governor in 1988. I think, it's remiss of these political programmes on the TV looking back as to the history of the referendum, how we got here, not to make more of that, because it was incredibly important in moving the Labour Party towards devolution, of reinvigorating the Scottish National Party, having Jim Sillars, win that by-election from absolutely nowhere. And the feeling that I'm getting now is the same feeling that we had in Govan. We knew there was something moving. We knew there was something exciting. It didn't show up in the polls in Govan until the last minute when the massive swing came about. But I'm fairly confident that's going to happen this time as well. There's something moving in the undergrowth, and the Scottish people are going to vote yes in quite large numbers.
Just to come back to the architecture a bit, there was something I was told once about when, in Edinburgh, when they were rebuilding the sort of Newtown part of it, one of the rejected plans was to build the whole thing in the shape of a Union Jack. And in your lecture, you talked about something that was done in the shape of a shamrock in Ireland, or by the Irish. But one of the things I wanted to ask you was, do you think that when Scotland becomes an independent country, there should be some kind of big, grand project? Hello world, we're here.
Well, I remember when I was at university, we were asked to design something on the bridge to nowhere in Glasgow, and I designed, using an old plastic bottle, myself and my twin put together this sort of parasitical type creature. It looked quite amazing and disgusting. I didn't know what it was for, but I went into university the next day and said, here's a parasite that's going to sit over the M8 in Glasgow. And they said, right, okay, explain the reasoning behind it. It looks great, Alasdair. And I said, well, this is going to be built after independence, and it's a parasite which everyone in Glasgow will drive under, and it will remind them of the way that the parasitical Labour Party fed off the insecurities and inhibitions of the Scottish people. Now, luckily, the Professor of Architecture was an SNP supporter, and he still is. But no, we shouldn't be doing anything like that. And likewise, when it comes to what happened in Ireland, I don't think we should be building shamrock-shaped buildings or haggis-shaped buildings or having grand plans. I do think what will happen, and people will laugh at this, I do think eventually there will be statues to Alex Salmons, funnily enough, because he is an incredibly important historical figure. When we win this referendum, he will be the most important historical figure in history in Scotland. But Ireland is very, very, very interesting example, very interesting comparison. I was on a programme a few years ago where this architect called Joe Fitzsimmons, he had brought out a book called Bungalow Bliss, and the Lighthouse were doing an exhibition. The Lighthouse in Glasgow were doing an exhibition to commemorate its 40th anniversary. And I was in the programme with Claire English on Radio Scotland, and I said to Joe Fitzsimmons, is it not strange that in Ireland they used music, they used religion, they used language, they used dance, they used sport in order to reassert or define a national identity after independence, but they didn't use architecture? But I was actually wrong about that, because as you say, they did produce this building. An architect called Michael Scott designed this building, which was glass and concrete. It was modern, and that was the Irish Pavilion at the 1939 World Fair in New York. But from above, it was shaped like a giant shamrock. But when you go back to these houses, the bungalows that were these, after this book came out, thousands, tens of thousands of these houses were built and have been built across rural Ireland. And a lot of people will argue, well, that's despoiled the Irish landscape. Look at it now. It's just all these buildings are everywhere. I sometimes think the busiest person in Ireland is the guy who photoshops these houses out of tourist brochures. But the thing is, if you're to ask an Irishman about it, if you think about the history of these houses, now, you had a situation in the 19th century where the Irish rural poor were completely wretched. They were living in half-acre plots. They had no security of tenure. When the potato crop failed, their lairds, the landowners, a lot of them based in England, they let them starve, they let them die. Now, the Irish emigrated in huge numbers, they died in huge numbers, but the ones that remained, they fought back. And through a lot of struggle and a lot of fight, they actually won security of tenure. They won the right to own that land. And they will probably think, what better expression of Irish cultural identity of our independence, the fact that we can build what the hell house we want on the land that we fought for, that our ancestors died for. And conversely, if you look at Scotland, the crofters, the cotters, they didn't win the right to own the land. Some crofting areas won some security of tenure, but huge parts of rural Scotland are empty. So that's a representation of architecture and politics.
Just as a last wee point, I just want to go on something that's sort of tangentially related to that, because a conversation I've had with people before is about the power of street names. Just as a quick example, in Glasgow there was Nelson Mandela Place, and that kind of made a political statement, but it wasn't always Nelson Mandela Place. Street names change.
And you've got, in every town in Britain, or at least every town in Scotland, you've got a Union Street or a Union Place or a Union Square. It was just a little interesting point. Do you think they should be changed to Independence Street or Independence Square, or should we be keeping the name as a kind of historical reminder, much like your parasite idea?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, Union Street in Aberdeen, there's a street that's full of pound shops and charity shops. It's, it's the richest part of Britain outside central London, and their main street is a complete mess. And it was once great, but it's now seen better days. So I think it should remain as Union Street because it's a good representation of the Union. But, the thing about street names and place names in general, when you drive through Ardnamurchan, for example, every little stream you'll go over has got its name in Gaelic. And because I can speak Gaelic, I can understand what these names mean. And I remember driving through there with my colleague and saying, do you know that wee island over there? There used to be squirrels on it, or there are squirrels on it. She goes, how do you know that? That's because we just drove over a little bridge which named the burn, and it's called Altail in the Fjordak. It's the burn of the island of the squirrels. So in a way, these street names will remind us of something which happened in the past. I mean, so you've got that in Gaelic. The Gaelic describes names of the mountains, names of streams. Everything reminds you of maybe a historical event that happened. So, keep it as Union Street so we remember we were once in this union. But having said that, I think when Scotland does become independent, there will be such energy. It will be absolutely wonderful, and there could be some huge projects. I don't think they'll be called independence projects or anything, but there'll be huge inward investment, and who knows, we could have Salmon Boulevard, we could have Nicola Lane, I don't know, but unlikely, but I don't think it really is that important.
I doubt we'll have Ian Davidson Place.
Although they'll find a place for him somewhere, but it won't be a grand street, that's for sure.
Okay, so Alasdair, thanks for coming on. That's been brilliant. Hope you enjoyed it. Sorry about the sound problems.
Michael, thanks very much. It was a pleasure to be on, and look forward to hearing more of your podcasts in the future. They're great.
Cheers.
Okay, you probably noticed something strange in there, but in the interest of full disclosure, at a couple of points we had some sound problems, and at my end it was so bad that I had to re-record a couple of the questions. So during that, there's a couple of questions that were actually in the conversation and a couple that I just repeated what I said at the time at the end, but I hope it wasn't too bad for you. There'll be a couple more podcasts out this week, and yeah, just to say, as usual on the Scottish Independence podcast, the guest gets to choose the tune, and this is what Alasdair chose, so I'll speak to you next time.